In the current racial climate, Black men are not in a position to be friends or have intimate partnerships with anyone outside of the race because of the subjugated position they're in. Black men have never made good decisions on a consistent basis that benefited the Black people as a whole. And as dating and marrying white women has been their only priority, it should be viewed as a treasonous crime against all Black people, and they should be ousted from the community. You should kick them out of your basement, stop visiting them in jail, stop letting them borrow your car, stop buying their music, stop supporting their movies, and this support should be stopped by other Black men as well. And by the end of this video, you'll see why. Because their degenerate behavior has not changed. We've all heard about vibrant and progressive Black towns after slavery and Reconstruction, and the most famous town was Black Wall Street because it was so wealthy, so much so that white business owners would borrow money from the Black business owners in the all-Black district of Tulsa. But you may not be aware that there were many beautiful, self-sufficient, all-Black progressive towns just like Black Wall Street. But as you know, all of these towns were burned to the ground by white people. Businesses were lost and many Black people lost their lives. But what you may not know is the domino effect of burning down these towns all started because of treasonous Black men.
Maurice Mays was a Black fellow who was very handsome, who liked white women, and white women liked him, and certainly 1919 was not the year to have these kinds of relationships. So there was a police officer in Knoxville who knew about Mays's activities and had warned him about dating white women and threatened to put him in the penitentiary if he were ever to catch him, and to do other terrible things to him if he caught him. A white woman by the name of Bertie Lindsay wound up. Well, the policeman who hated Mays was investigating the case, and he said, I know exactly who that was. So they went to Mays's house and rousted him out of bed and took him to the scene of the crime, put him under a dimly lit street lamp, and the woman identified him as the. When word got out that he was of a white woman, a mob formed.
Someone gives the command, march boys. They march down Market Street, counting off, military style, until they just basically surround the jail. They refuse the final offer to search, and at that point, they tear down a telephone pole, start using that as a battering ram. Knoxville is under basically martial law for the next few days.
So Mays was eventually sent to the electric chair in March of 1922. And I always say that he really wasn't electrocuted for the white woman, because I never saw any evidence of that in any of the court transcripts that I read. But he went to the electric chair for dealing with white women, which was a real taboo in 1919. So he paid with his life for that indiscretion rather than being convicted of the for which he was accused.
In April, in the Baltimore County village of Rockland, a fateful encounter set off a tragic chain of events.
At 6 o'clock, April 4th, 1885, Katie Gray had just gone to the railroad station with her sister. Katie Gray was coming back from the railroad station when she met Howard Cooper. And she had apparently known Howard Cooper before. They had words. Katie turned, started walking home. Howard Cooper followed Katie Gray into the woods where something happened.
It's impossible to know the truth of what happened that day. Cooper had a history of harassment. Both later testified that Cooper did accost the girl.
After about 2 hours, Katie Gray's dog, Bruno, comes running out barking and presumably chases Howard Cooper away. Katie Gray runs back to her household, and her father is incensed. Her father very quickly figures out what happened. She probably mentions Howard Cooper's name, and within hours, Daniel Gray, Katie Gray's father, puts together friends, I think it's fair to call them a mob, who scour the countryside looking for Howard Cooper.
Cooper eludes the mob for 5 days. The manhunt consumes the county. There is no presumption of innocence. Negro guilty of fiendish assault. The excitement is intense over an outrage committed by a Negro named Howard Cooper.
They were incensed and they thought, this brute is going to get away with it, so we have to take matters in our own hands.
By this time, they'd been just chomping at the bit to get their chance to lynch Howard Cooper, and they did not want to wait any longer.
The next day was Sunday, July 12th.
Rumors start to filter through the town that something is going to happen soon.
In 2s and 3s, men collect on the outskirts of town.
One man pulls a rope out from underneath his jacket, says, "This is a cravat for Howard Cooper."
As darkness gathers, groups of masked men converge on the jail. From the family quarters on the 2nd floor, the sheriff's daughter directs them to the back. There, the mob has an easier time of it. They break the door down, find Cooper hiding under a mattress in his cell, and drag him outside with a noose already around his neck. They waste no time tossing the rope over the branch of a nearby sycamore tree. One witness says the whole affair was orderly and expeditious.
And about 40 men pull on one end, lifting Howard Cooper off the ground. He dies of asphyxiation. Usually, hanging somebody is quick, it breaks somebody's neck, but in this case, it's a long process of suffocation.
By 3 in the morning, the mob had disbanded, leaving Cooper's body hanging in front of the jail in full view.
In 1921, a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma called the Greenwood District was a bustling community of Black-owned businesses. Tulsa locals know that period of Greenwood's history as a kind of golden age.
If you can imagine just like an old-time downtown, things like movie theaters, pharmacies, hair salons, and so forth.
They called it Black Wall Street.
It was a mecca. It was a huge success.
But Black Wall Street was also an anomaly. It thrived at a time when the KKK was incredibly active in Oklahoma, and the nation had just been through the Red Summer of 1919, when white mobs murdered Black people in dozens of incidents across the U.S.
There needed to be a sort of match or an igniter tossed on these embers. And that trigger event was an incident that involved 2 teenagers. Dick Rowland, 19-year-old Black boy who shined shoes downtown. Sarah Page, 17-year-old white girl who ran an elevator in a downtown building called the Drexel Building. He went to the building, boarded the elevator. Something happened. Sarah Page began to scream. They both ran out of the elevator.
Now, we don't know exactly what happened in this elevator, but a day later, Rowland was arrested and taken to the courthouse. The local newspaper ran an article claiming Rowland had assaulted Page. Even though Page refused to press charges, the article was essentially a call to action for whites.
A large white mob began to gather on the lawn of the courthouse. Dick Rowland was in jail on the top floor. A number of Black men, several dozen, marched down to the courthouse to protect him, some of them armed. There was a struggle between one of the Black men in the small group and one of the white men in the larger group, and things sort of went south from that point.
hundreds of white people descended upon Black Wall Street, armed. Black residents withdrew behind the railroad tracks that marked off the Greenwood district. Some of them were armed and fought back, but they were outnumbered by the white mob, which shot their way through. The white mob murdered, they looted, and they set fire to Black Wall Street.
This was the strategy, if you will, of how to deal with these communities, with these successful Black communities. The effects were disastrous.
For 2 days, the Greenwood district burned. Martial law was declared, and the National Guard was brought in. By the time the massacre ended, Greenwood was in ruins. More than 1,200 homes were destroyed, and 35 blocks burned. As for those that survived, thousands of them lived in tent cities in the months that followed, and were left to pick up the pieces of rubble they once called home.
They came on the first day of January, and they did not stop burning and shooting and hanging and lynching until January the 7th.
That picture shattered on New Year's Day 1923 when a mob of white men invaded Rosewood, burning homes and churches and shooting people as they fled.
1923. The black town of Rosewood was a land of opportunity.
In 1997, Warner Brothers produced a movie about the town's history, bringing what happened on that tragic day to the big screen. The film, based on accounts at the time of what started the attack. Allegations from a white woman in the neighboring community of Sumner that a black man had assaulted her. Pickett disputes that narrative. She says family members told her it was actually a white man who assaulted the white woman.
The wages that blacks were paid at the Omaha plants were lower than white workers, but it was significantly more money than they could earn in the South. Hundreds of blacks began to replace white plant workers, and by 1915, a burgeoning black community was established near the meat packaging plants in South Omaha and the near north side of the city. Racial tension began to build in Omaha. This tension culminated in the summer of 1919, when one plant worker in particular met a horrible fate.
This was the period of red hot summer. This was the period where about that what it is, you'd already had the riots in St. Louis, other places. And now you're having them in Omaha. What happened was they had a woman say that she had been a black man. And that's all that needed to be said.
On September 25th, 1919, Agnes Lobeck identified 40-year-old Will Brown as the man who attacked her. Brown was then arrested and taken to the Douglas County Courthouse. Before Brown was even identified, a civic storm was already brewing in Omaha due to a series of inflammatory stories published in the Omaha Bee and struggles for political power between racketeer Thomas Dennison and Omaha's mayor Edward Smith. On the evening of September 28, 1919, a crowd of an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 people gathered outside the Douglas County Courthouse and demanded that Brown be handed over to them. Inside the courthouse, a frightened judge and other prisoners sent a note down to the crowd, saying that they would surrender Brown. The bloodthirsty crowd could not wait and rushed into the courthouse to seize Brown. Once in the hands of the crowd, Brown was beaten, hung from a lamppost more than 100 times. The ghastly melee ended with the burning of Will Brown's body. An Omaha World Herald photographer captured one of the most infamous photographs in American history. After the riot, federal troops were called in, and for 2 days, Omaha was under martial law. Even though over 100 people were arrested in connection with the riot and the murder of Will Brown, no one was charged.
In the late 1800s, Wilmington, North Carolina was the state's largest city. It had a majority black population, and historians today describe it as a rarity in the post-Civil War American South.
Wilmington, prior to November 1898, was what the New South could be at the cusp of the 20th century.
There was an unusual degree of black prosperity.
In Wilmington, there were successful black entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, but also black elected officials. And for a time, that was true throughout the state. In one speech that Democrats printed in a Wilmington paper, a prominent Georgia writer named Rebecca Felton said,
"If it takes lynching a black man a day to protect white womanhood, I say lynch."
Her speech prompted a Wilmington black man named Alex Manley, owner of the black-run Daily Record newspaper, to respond with a column. He made a simple observation that, at the time, was shocking.
That white women who had liaisons with black men did so voluntarily and enthusiastically.
This black man, Alexander Manley, owned a printing business, which was very important to the black community because this is how they were informed of what was happening in their town. So when this white woman wrote about black men assaulting white women, Manley decided to write a column defending these black men. And even if it was true what he wrote, that was not the time, and he shouldn't have defended the derelict behavior of these black men. And white men were not going to receive that message well about their women.
Manley wrote, "Every Negro lynched is called a big burly black brute, when in fact many were sufficiently attractive for white girls to fall in love with them."
Manley pretty much said, in a nutshell, sometimes white women choose to be with black men.
And as for Alex Manley, we demand that he leave this city forever within 24 hours. The next morning, hundreds of white men marched to the offices of the Daily Record. Manley was gone. He had fled to save his own life. They set the Daily Record building on fire. This is where it once stood. Meanwhile, the mob had grown to about 2,000 men, and the violence spilled into the streets. In these photos, X's mark where the first black residents were killed. Many black residents hid for days in the swamps and the wooded cemeteries in the city, including Cynthia's great-grandmother. And thousands of other residents fled Wilmington, never to return.
This last story about Alex Manley was significant because he documented the fact that black men straight off the plantation knew the racial climate, knew that black towns were being burned to the ground, and black people were being hung and killed. But that was not enough to stop them from continuing the same behavior. And the black men who should have kicked these men out of the community chose instead to defend the behavior, just like Alex Manley did, and paid the ultimate price. White men are not jealous of these relationships. He's protecting the sanctity of his race, and their ideology has not changed. They feel that black people are second-class citizens and that they are superior to black people, even if it's a subconscious feeling. Could it be that the constant racial divide and the tension among black men and white men be caused in large part due to black men being with white women? White men shun white women who date and marry black men. They take a stand in their position and they don't date them, especially if they have biracial children. The black community should do the same and black men who are loyal to the race should kick out the ones who have an incessant need to be with white women because they have proven that they didn't care then and they don't care now about the danger this places on the next black man's life. And that puts all black men in a constant state of the "I could be next" syndrome.